January 24th, 1915, the North Sea. A great warship lies dying on her side, her keel exposed to the gray winter sky like the belly of a mortally wounded beast. Across her capsizing hull, hundreds of men stand in perfect formation. They are not panicking. They are not scrambling for safety. They are waiting, with a discipline that would seem incomprehensible to anyone who has not served at sea, waiting for the inevitable. In 8.5 minutes, this ship will slip beneath the waves and take nearly 800 of them with her. Some will slide into the freezing water. Others will take running leaps, hurling themselves away from the steel that has been their home. And a few officers will link arms and walk calmly down the curving side of their ship, step by step into the sea as if descending a staircase to the afterlife. This is SMS Blücher, and her death is not an accident. It is the result of a chain of decisions, errors, and missed warnings that began months before in the secret chambers of British intelligence and will echo forward for years to come. Because this is not simply a story of destruction, it is a story of brilliant code-breaking and catastrophic signaling errors, of ships that should never have sailed and battles that should never have been fought, of lessons learned by one navy and fatally ignored by another, lessons written in fire and blood that would be forgotten within 18 months, costing thousands more lives in explosions that could have been prevented. This is the Battle of Dogger Bank, and it begins, like so many naval tragedies, with a secret that was no longer secret. To understand what happened on that frozen January morning, we must first understand the invisible war being waged in a cramped office inside the British Admiralty. Room 40. Its staff were an unlikely collection of cryptanalysts, academics, linguists, chess champions, and naval officers working in conditions of absolute secrecy. Their task was to crack the German naval codes, and by January 1915 they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The breakthrough came from 3 captured German codebooks. The first was recovered from the light cruiser SMS Magdeburg after she ran aground in the Baltic Sea. Russian sailors had pulled it from the arms of a drowned German signalman and passed it to their British allies. The second was seized from a German merchant ship near Melbourne. The third was dragged up from the seabed in a lead-lined chest, thrown overboard from a sinking German destroyer. With these 3 codebooks, Room 40 could read German naval communications almost as easily as their intended recipients. On January 23, 1915, they intercepted wireless traffic from the German base at Wilhelmshaven. What they decoded changed everything. Rear-Admiral Franz von Hipper was sailing at dawn with his battlecruiser squadron. Destination, the Dogger Bank. Within hours, the First Lord of the Admiralty, a young politician named Winston Churchill, sat with his naval staff planning an ambush. If they moved quickly, they could destroy the most powerful striking force of the German Navy. But who were the men who would fight this battle? Who would command these great fleets as they raced toward their collision in the North Sea? Franz von Hipper was not born to the sea. The son of a shopkeeper who died when Franz was only 3, he entered the Imperial German Navy as a teenage cadet in 1881. By 1914, he had risen to command the 8th Scouting Group, Germany's battlecruiser force, through sheer professional excellence. He was methodical, careful, and utterly competent. The British press called him a baby killer for his raids on England's east coast. His men called him one of the finest ship handlers of his generation. His opponent could not have been more different. Vice-Admiral Sir David Beatty was everything Hipper was not. Dashing, aristocratic, promoted through connections as much as combat prowess. He had reached captain at 29, the youngest since Nelson, and rear-admiral at 38. Winston Churchill adored him, seeing in Beatty the bold, aggressive spirit the Royal Navy needed. These 2 commanders had nearly met before. In December 1914, Hipper's battlecruisers had bombarded the English coastal towns of Scarborough, Hartlepool, and Whitby, killing 137 civilians, the first successful attack on British soil since the 17th century. Beatty had raced south to intercept, but fog and confusion allowed Hipper to escape. The British public howled for revenge. Remember, Scarborough became a recruitment slogan. Now, 6 weeks later, Beatty would have his chance. Yet for all the power Hipper commanded that morning, for all the speed and firepower of his battlecruiser squadron, there was a flaw, a fatal weakness that would doom everything. SMS Blücher. She was not a battlecruiser at all. She was an armored cruiser. an older, slower, less powerful design that had no business sailing in company with ships like Seydlitz and Derfflinger. Her main guns fired 8-inch shells. The battlecruisers carried 11 and 12-inch weapons. Her maximum speed was 23 knots on a good day. The true battlecruisers could make 26. How did she come to be there? The answer lies in a German intelligence failure. In 1905, German naval planners believed Britain's next armored cruisers would carry 9-inch guns. They designed Blücher as a superior response with 12 8-inch guns and 6 twin turrets. It was a fine design for fighting enemy cruisers, but the British had already leaped ahead. In secret, they were building HMS Invincible, the world's first battlecruiser, armed with 8 12-inch guns. By the time German intelligence discovered the truth, Blücher's construction was too far advanced to change. She was obsolete before she was even launched. Normally, Blücher would never have joined a battlecruiser sortie, but on January 23, 1915, the battlecruiser Von der Tann was in dry dock for maintenance. Hipper needed a fourth ship for his squadron. Blücher was the only available option. It was a decision that would cost nearly 800 lives. And so, on the morning of January 24, 1915, these forces converged on the gray waters of the North Sea. The weather, for once, seemed to favor the hunter rather than the hunted. The morning dawned clear and cold, unusual for January when storms and fog typically shrouded these waters. Visibility was excellent. The sea was calm. It was perfect hunting weather. At 7 o'clock, Beatty's 5 battlecruisers crossed through the prearranged rendezvous point, 30 nautical miles north of the Doggerbank. Ahead and to port, light cruisers spread out in a scouting line. Behind them, the Harwich force was racing north with 3 more light cruisers and 35 destroyers. At 7 minutes past 7, gun flashes lit the southern horizon. The light cruiser Aurora had encountered German screening vessels. She challenged, received no response, and opened fire. The Battle of Doggerbank had begun. Within minutes, lookouts aboard HMS Lion spotted the distinctive silhouettes of German warships to the southeast. Beatty ordered the chase. His battlecruisers worked up to 22 knots, then 24, then 26. By 0852, he had signaled for 29 knots, an impossible speed for his older ships, but necessary to close the range. Hipper, meanwhile, had seen the smoke of approaching ships, too many ships. This was no chance encounter with fishing trawlers. Counting the columns of smoke, he realized he was facing the British battlecruiser force, and they held the windward position. He ordered his squadron to turn for home. The chase was on. What followed next was something unprecedented in the history of naval warfare, something that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. Never before had warships engaged at such distances, at such speeds, while racing across the open ocean. At 9 o'clock, HMS Lion opened fire. The range was 20,000 yards, more than 11 miles. No battleship had ever fired in anger at such a distance. Pre-war British gunnery practice rarely exceeded 8 miles. German practice was even shorter at 4 miles. Now Lion's gunners were attempting to hit a moving target at nearly 3 times those distances. The first salvo fell short, the second passed over, the third and fourth found their mark, and they found Blücher. She was exactly where you would expect the slowest ship to be, at the rear of the German line. As Hipper's squadron fled southeast at maximum speed, Blücher struggled to keep pace. She made the perfect target. Lion's early salvos tore into her. One struck the waterline, flooding compartments and immediately reducing her speed. Another carried away her after-superstructure, disabled 2 turrets, and killed between 200 and 300 men in a single explosion. A German survivor later described the horror. The shells bore their way even to the stokehold. The coal in the bunkers was set on fire. Since the bunkers were half empty, the fire burned merrily. In the engine room, a shell licked up the oil and sprayed it around in flames of blue and green. Men were picked up by that terrific air pressure and tossed to a horrible death among the machinery. The range was closing, and Blücher was dying. Yet the British were not having everything their own way. Even as Blücher burned and Hipper's squadron fled, the Germans were about to deliver a blow that should have changed everything. At 9:40, a devastating blow struck Hipper's flagship. An enormous 13.5-inch shell from Lion smashed into Seydlitz's afterbarbette, the armored structure protecting the rear turret's ammunition supply. The shell did not penetrate the magazine. It did not need to. The explosion flashed into the working chamber and ignited the propellant charges stored there. In an instant, flames roared upward into the turret and downward into the ammunition handling rooms. Men tried to escape through a connecting door to the forward turret, and the fire followed them. 159 men died in seconds. Both rear turrets were completely destroyed. Seydlitz was moments from a catastrophic magazine explosion that would have broken her in two. What saved her was a single man. His name was Wilhelm Heidkamp. He was a Pumpenmeister, a petty officer responsible for the ship's damage control systems. As flames consumed the ammunition chambers, Heidkamp fought his way to the magazine flooding valves. They were glowing red-hot. He turned them anyway. Seawater rushed into the magazines, drowning the fires before they could reach the main ammunition stores. Heidkamp saved over 1,000 lives that morning. But his hands were burned to the bone, his lungs seared by superheated air. He would never fully recover. He died in 1931, his body still carrying the wounds of that desperate January morning. The German Navy named a destroyer in his honor. Few men ever earned the tribute more. Seydlitz survived, barely. But now the tide of battle was turning, and it was turning against the British. German gunnery was finding its mark. Shell after shell struck HMS Lion, 16 heavy hits in total. One pierced the waterline near the boilers, causing severe flooding. Another smashed through the roof of a turret, disabling one gun. A third penetrated the armored belt and gave the ship a 10-degree list to port. At 10:50, lookouts on Lion reported a submarine periscope on the starboard bow. No British submarines were in the area. It had to be German. Beatty ordered an emergency turn to port, swinging his entire force 90 degrees away from the torpedo threat. It was almost certainly a false alarm, probably nothing more than a spent torpedo running on the surface. But the turn opened the range catastrophically, and worse was to come. At 11 o'clock, another German shell struck Lion near the boiler rooms. The damage was crippling. The port engine had to be stopped. Speed fell to 15 knots, then lower. As Beatty's flagship slowed, the other British battlecruisers raced past her, leaving her behind. Beatty was no longer in control of the battle. And it was in this moment, with his flagship crippled, his communications severed, and his quarry escaping, that Beatty made the decisions that would haunt the Royal Navy for years to come. HMS Lion was shrouded in smoke, her wireless disabled, most of her signal halyards shot away. Beatty had only 2 remaining ways to communicate with his fleet, flag signals on the 2 remaining halyards. He needed to send 2 messages. The first was course northeast, a correction to limit the emergency turn and resume the chase. The second was engage the enemy's rear, a clear order to pursue Hipper's fleeing battlecruisers. Flag Lieutenant Ralph Seymour hoisted both signals simultaneously on the 2 available halyards. Rear-Admiral Gordon Moore, commanding from HMS New Zealand, read them together as a single order: attack the enemy bearing northeast. And what was bearing northeast at that moment? SMS Blücher, crippled, on fire, her speed reduced to 17 knots, circling helplessly out of control. Moore made what seemed the obvious interpretation. He led all 4 British battlecruisers toward Blücher. On the stricken Lion, Beatty watched in horror as his entire force abandoned the chase. He tried to correct the error. He ordered his signalmen to hoist Nelson's famous signal from Trafalgar, engage the enemy more closely. It was not in the signal book. Beatty substituted the closest equivalent, keep nearer to the enemy. But by the time the signal was flying, Moore's ships were too far away to read it. Seydlitz, Moltke, and Derfflinger, battered but still capable of 24 knots, escaped toward the German coast. Behind them, alone, surrounded, and doomed, SMS Blücher prepared to face 4 battlecruisers, 4 light cruisers, and a dozen destroyers. What happened next speaks to something deeper than tactics or technology. It speaks to the heart of what men are capable of when all hope is gone. Blücher had every reason to surrender. She was hit perhaps 70 times by heavy shells. Fires raged through her hull. Her speed was gone. 2 of her 6 turrets were destroyed, and the others were running low on ammunition. Against her stood ships carrying weapons she could not match and armor she could not pierce. She fought anyway. For nearly 2 hours, Blücher battled alone against impossible odds. Her remaining turrets continued firing until they fell silent, one by one. She repulsed attacks by destroyers, driving off torpedo runs with her secondary guns. When light cruisers closed to finish her, she hit back hard enough to force them away. One of her final salvos struck HMS Meteor, a British destroyer, in the engine room, killing 4 men and crippling the ship. Lieutenant Frederick Peters fought his way through flames to save 2 wounded men. He would receive the Distinguished Service Order for his courage that day and a posthumous Victoria Cross in the next war. On Blücher's bridge, Captain Alexander Erdmann refused to strike his colors. His ship was dying, but she would not go quietly. The end, when it came, was both swift and agonizingly slow. At 12:40, HMS Arethusa closed to point-blank range and fired her torpedoes. 2 struck Blücher amidships. Other destroyers followed. In total, 7 torpedoes tore into the already sinking ship. A British officer watched what happened next. She heeled completely over and sank in 8.5 minutes, hundreds of men clambering over her side and standing there just as if it were the upper deck, waiting for the final plunge. But there was no plunge. Slowly and slowly she sank, and as she went down, some were sliding into the sea, others taking running leaps. What the survivors did in those final minutes has passed into naval legend. The crew assembled on the capsizing hull. Despite everything, the fires, the flooding, the carnage, they formed ranks. They stood at attention. The flag was still flying. Then, as the keel rose toward the sky, a group of German officers linked arms. Together, they walked calmly down the curving side of their ship, step by step into the sea. They were last seen swimming toward groups of enlisted men, helping those who could not swim, sharing their life belts, dying as they had lived, as officers. The story might have ended there, a tale of heroism and loss, of men doing their duty to the last. But there was one final terrible chapter yet to be written. HMS Arethusa lowered her boats. British sailors hauled German survivors from the freezing water, nearly 260 men rescued in the first minutes. At one point, a British stoker named Nobby Clark was helping German sailors over the side when one greeted him by name. The German had been Clark's next-door neighbor in Hull before the war. Then the aircraft came. A German seaplane appeared overhead and began dropping bombs on its own men, on the British rescue boats, on the sailors struggling in the water. Minutes later, Zeppelin L-5 arrived and joined the attack. The Germans had made a terrible mistake. Blücher's tripod mast, unusual for a German ship, had confused the air crews. They thought they were attacking a sinking British battlecruiser. Commodore Tyrwhitt had no choice. He recalled the boats and ordered his ships to withdraw. Behind him, German sailors watched the British vessels steam away. Some drowned before British eyes, despite their life belts. Others simply slipped beneath the waves as the cold took them. Of Blücher's crew of more than 1,000 men, 792 died. Captain Erdmann was among the survivors, but his rescue came too late. He died of pneumonia 3 weeks later in a British military hospital. The Royal Scots Territorials fired a salute over his grave. 22 years later, his widow would christen the next German ship to bear the name Blücher, a heavy cruiser destined for her own tragic fate in the fjords of Norway. So what had been won? What had been lost? On paper, at least, the answer seemed clear. The Battle of Dogger Bank was a British victory. One German ship sunk, another badly damaged, nearly 1,000 enemy sailors killed or captured. The Royal Navy had proven it could intercept German raiders before they reached British shores, but for many in the Admiralty it felt like defeat. Hipper had escaped. 3 German battlecruisers, including the wounded Seydlitz, had steamed safely back to Wilhelmshaven. A signaling error had allowed the most valuable targets to slip away while the British concentrated on a ship that was already dying. Rear-Admiral Moore was quietly removed from command. Captain Pelly of HMS Tiger was blamed for targeting the wrong ship. But the man most responsible for the signaling disaster, Flag Lieutenant Ralph Seymour, remained at Beatty's side. He would make similar errors at Jutland, yet beneath the recriminations and the blame, there lay something far more important, something that would prove more consequential than any tactical victory or defeat. Both navies had been taught a lesson that morning in the North Sea. Only one of them learned it. The Germans returned home shaken but enlightened. The near destruction of Seydlitz revealed a catastrophic vulnerability. A single shell penetrating a turret could flash down into the magazines and destroy the entire ship. They had survived only because of Wilhelm Heidkamp's sacrifice. Admiral Hipper demanded changes. Double flap doors were fitted to ammunition hoists. Propellant charges were kept in protective containers until the moment of loading. Magazine hatches were ordered sealed during combat. Flash protection was massively improved. The British investigated similar damage to HMS Lion and did nothing. They emphasized rate of fire over safety. They kept ammunition hoists open for faster loading. They left propellant charges exposed in ready racks. Their anti-flash procedures remained inadequate. 16 months later, at the Battle of Jutland, the price came due. HMS Indefatigable blew up with the loss of over 1,000 men. HMS Queen Mary exploded 20 minutes later, another 1,300 dead. HMS Invincible, the very ship whose existence had made Blücher obsolete, broke in half when her magazines detonated. All 3 British battlecruisers died from the same cause: flash fires reaching unprotected magazines. All 3 might have survived if the Royal Navy had learned what the Germans learned from Dogger Bank. After watching 2 of his ships explode in half an hour, Admiral Beatty turned to his flag captain and spoke the most famous words of the naval war. "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." There was, and the warning had been written in fire and blood on the North Sea in the death throes of SMS Blücher 18 months before. Today, more than a century later, an image still exists, held in the Imperial War Museum, studied by naval historians, remembered by anyone who has seen it once. A great ship lies on her side. Across her upturned hull, hundreds of men stand in formation, waiting for the end. Some are sliding into the sea, others are helping their comrades. A few are simply standing, watching, accepting. Fleet Paymaster John Spencer Place captured this moment from the deck of HMS Arethusa. The photograph appeared in the Daily Mail 3 weeks later. It shocked the British public, not because it showed German suffering, but because it showed German courage. These were not monsters. They were sailors, just like British sailors, doing their duty for their country. They had fought a battle they could not win, on a ship that should never have been there, against odds that allowed no possibility of survival. And they had died as well as men can die. The wreck of SMS Blücher lies today in 60 meters of water near the Dogger Bank, a war grave protected by international law, visited occasionally by divers who pay their respects to the men who still rest within her rusting hull. On calm days, they say, you can still see the outline of her turrets pointing toward the surface, still ready, still defiant, still waiting for an enemy that no longer exists. For the men of the Blücher, the battle never really ended. It just grew very, very quiet. The Battle of Dogger Bank lasted 6 hours. It claimed nearly 1,000 lives. And its true significance would not become clear until May 31st, 1916, when the lessons it taught, and the lessons it should have taught, would determine the fate of nations in the greatest naval battle the world has ever seen. But that is a story for another time.